What if one of the most familiar images in history isn't actually true? For centuries, we've pictured three wise men, or even three kings, following a brilliant star across the night sky. Their names, their number, their journey. Everyone thinks they know this story by heart. But what if that truth we grew up with is only a story shaped by tradition, not by history? What if the real identity of the Magi doesn't just challenge our imagination, it challenges everything we assume about wisdom, faith, and the courage to search for truth? So here's the question I want to ask you. If sacred truth isn't found in what we were taught, but in what we never dared to question, are you ready to question it now? Because to uncover the real story, we can't start in Bethlehem. We have to go back, centuries earlier, to a place where a very different journey quietly began. And that's where our investigation starts. For generations, we've carried a familiar picture of the Magi. Three royal men, dressed in glittering robes, bearing famous names, kneeling at a manger the very night Jesus was born. It's poetic, it's iconic, and yet, none of it appears in the biblical text. The ancient manuscripts never tell us there were three of them. They never call them kings. They never mention their names, and Matthew certainly never places them at a manger. These are layers of tradition, not layers of scripture. And when we peel those layers back, a far more intriguing story emerges. A story that asks us to rethink what we thought we knew, and to wonder why the truth, though simpler, is far more profound. To understand the Magi, we must leave behind the Christmas cards and return to the ancient world, to Persia. In that empire, the word Magi didn't refer to fortune-tellers or casual stargazers. It described an elite class, scholars, priests, astronomers, and guardians of sacred knowledge. They lived at the crossroads of religion, science, and power. And during Israel's exile to Babylon, something extraordinary happened. Jewish prophetic writings, especially the visions of Daniel, came into direct contact with Persian scholarship. It was an unlikely meeting of minds, Hebrew prophecy and Persian intellectualism sitting on the same shelves. And from that encounter rises one timeless truth. When truth meets a mind willing to listen, it can travel beyond every border and outlive every empire. The Magi didn't accidentally stumble into the Christmas story. They had been quietly absorbing bits and pieces of Jewish prophecy for generations. But absorbing knowledge is one thing. Acting on it is something entirely different. And the question becomes, what was so compelling that these respected scholars would abandon their comfort, gather their caravan, and venture across thousands of miles of uncertainty? The answer begins with a star, or rather, with a sign in the heavens. Scholars today debate the nature of that star. Was it a planetary alignment, a rare astronomical event, something natural, something supernatural? Matthew's description hints at something more than physics alone. This star appears, disappears, moves, and then stops over a specific home. No ordinary celestial body behaves that way. So perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps it was never about what the star was, but about what the star did. It guided, it beckoned, it illuminated a path meant only for those willing to follow. Sometimes, divine light doesn't bend the laws of nature. It bends the direction of our lives. And when the sign appeared, only the Magi had the spiritual courage to read it for what it was. The Magi's trek across the desert wasn't merely a physical expedition. It was a metaphor for the spiritual journey every human being faces. Their story traces a profound inner progression, from knowledge to faith, from observation to action, from curiosity to worship. They moved from what they knew to what they trusted, from what they studied to what they were willing to seek with their lives. That's what transforms intellectual curiosity into spiritual courage. The Magi became a symbol of every soul brave enough to leave behind comfortable certainties in search of a deeper truth. And in that sense, the desert wasn't an obstacle. It was a refining fire. Their gifts weren't random, and they weren't just expensive. They were symbolic, deeply, theologically, and personally. Gold, the power to do good. Gold represents kingship, authority, and influence. In our lives, gold is the talent, privilege, or position we've been given. The question isn't whether we have it. It's whether we use it for ourselves or for a greater good. Frankincense, the call to lift our hearts. Higher. Frankincense is the fragrance of prayer, worship, and transcendence. It points to the part of every human being that longs for meaning, for something beyond the material world. Myrrh, the courage to face pain and sacrifice. Myrrh was used in burial rituals. It acknowledges suffering, mortality, and the cost of redemption. In our own stories, myrrh represents wounds, losses, and painful transformations that ultimately shape who we become. Together, the gifts whisper a universal truth. Not everyone holds gold, frankincense, or myrrh. But every human being carries something they must offer in order for their life to become whole. Matthew sets up a sharp, almost jarring juxtaposition. Herod hears of the child and is terrified. He reacts with paranoia, the fear of losing power. The Jewish religious scholars know the scriptures by heart. They can quote the prophecy word for word, yet they won't walk a mere 6 miles to see if it's true. The Magi, outsiders with only fragments of knowledge, travel hundreds of miles through danger simply because they believe the truth might be there. It's a brilliant spiritual mirror. Herod shows what fear does to the human heart. The priests show what apathy does to faith. The Magi show what courage does to the soul. And the uncomfortable question is this: which one resembles us more? The story reaches its climax in a single, almost quiet line. They return to their country by another road. On the surface, this seems like a practical decision. Avoid Herod. Choose a safer path. But spiritually, this is the turning point. After encountering the child, they could not go back the same way. Not outwardly, and not inwardly. A true encounter with truth changes not only what we see, but the direction of our entire life. If nothing changes in us after meeting Christ, perhaps we have met only information, not transformation. And so the question becomes unavoidable. How many times in our own lives have we seen a guiding star, felt a nudge, sensed a calling, and yet still returned by the same old path? And now, after peeling away layers of legend, tradition, and assumption, we find ourselves right back where we started, but seeing everything with new eyes. Because the truth doesn't weaken faith. It deepens it. It reminds us that even the stories we think we know are far larger, far older, and far more mysterious than we imagined. The Magi weren't meant to be icons frozen in stained glass. Their journey is a mirror, held up to anyone willing to walk toward a light they cannot yet understand. As one theologian once said, we're not called to be wise because we know everything, but wise because we dare to move when the light appears. So maybe the question that truly matters isn't who were the Magi, but something far more personal. When a star appears in your own life, will you stay where it feels safe? Or will you take the first step into the unknown? That's history. But what about you? What do you think this story is really saying? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. Your perspective helps shape the conversations we build here. And if reflections like this speak to you, if you enjoy exploring ancient mysteries with a fresh lens, consider subscribing. Not out of obligation, but so you won't miss the next journey we take together. Because the search for truth is far from over.